In a world where empires rose on glory and buried their sins in silence, this channel opens the doors history tried to erase. Here, we don't tell the stories you learned in school. We uncover the rituals, the betrayals, the forbidden truths carved into palace walls. Every video is a descent into power, fear, and the dark secrets of kings, queens, and forgotten victims. So if you're ready to witness the side of history they tried to erase, subscribe to this channel so we can stay connected. Be sure to like the video and step into the shadows with us, where the real past still breathes. Rome, the empire that worshipped the bloodlines, feared its emperors, and recorded every crime except the ones committed inside the palace. Behind the golden walls of the Palatine Hill, 3 imperial sisters lived under the protection of the most powerful man on earth. But protection can become imprisonment, and family can become ownership when absolute power answers to no law. Ancient historians wrote whispers. Servants recorded fragments. Priests concealed rituals the world was never meant to see. Tonight, we descend into the private chambers of Emperor Caligula, where Rome's darkest taboo was not hidden. It was displayed, and what he forced his sisters to endure did not end with their deaths. The palace that erased screams in Rome's brightest marble halls, the darkest rituals were never written down, only endured. A slave trained to see nothing witnesses a family dinner that feels like a funeral with living guests. Tonight, the Palatine Palace doesn't host a feast. It hosts a warning. The slave's name is Halitus. He is 26, old enough to understand that the empire is built on documents and that the palace is built on silence. He was bought young, trained younger, and polished into the most valuable skill Rome can breed in a human being: discretion. In the imperial quarters, he is not a man. He is furniture that breathes, a moving shadow with hands that pour wine and eyes that never linger. Tonight, his hands will still pour, but his mind will not stay obedient. The room is the triclinium reserved for the emperor's private gatherings, a chamber of polished stone and warm torchlight that makes gold look like fire and skin look like ivory. The couches are arranged in the old Roman way, meant for leisure and philosophy, meant for the illusion that power can relax. The air smells of spiced wine and roasted meat, yet beneath the sweetness there is something else, an iron note, like a blade hidden under silk. Caligula reclines in the central position. Coins across the empire display his face as a divine promise, but up close he looks like a man whose sleep has been stolen for years. He is 25, tall and athletic, yet his eyes carry a hollow depth, as if something behind them comes and goes without warning. His voice is educated, almost gentle, the kind of tone that makes cruelty sound reasonable. On the couches near him lie 3 women, his sisters. Rome knows their names the way Rome knows its gods. Agrippina, the eldest, sharp-featured, watchful, her attention always measuring angles like a soldier in an ambush. Drusilla, the favorite, beautiful in a way that makes men lower their eyes, her expression practiced into calm. Julia Livilla, the youngest, still soft with youth, trembling just enough that the wine cup clicks faintly against her ring. They are dressed in silk, adorned with jewelry, surrounded by wealth that should mean protection. But Halitus has served long enough to know the truth of the palace. Riches do not protect you from the one who owns the room. Caligula speaks of philosophy. He quotes Epicurus, discussing pleasure and pain like they are ideas floating safely above the world. He invites responses as if this were an ordinary family gathering, as if blood alone makes people safe. Drusilla answers politely. Agrippina answers carefully. Julia drinks too quickly, like someone trying to blur the edges of reality before it cuts. Halitus watches without watching. That is his survival. Yet his instincts scream in the quiet places inside him because he recognizes patterns, not from rumor, from timing. From the way the women breathe when the emperor shifts closer. From the way Laughter arrives half a beat late, as if summoned by fear rather than humor. In Rome, public law worships modesty and family honor. In Rome, there are taboos so ancient they feel like nature itself. And yet, Helotus has learned that inside these walls, the emperor's will is the only law that matters. The gods of tradition bow to the god of power. A casual gesture ends the conversation. The emperor sets down his cup, and the room changes. The air tightens. The servants feel it first. Helotus knows the signal, the way a prisoner knows the sound of keys. When Caligula says, "You may go," he does not look at Helotus. He looks at his sisters as if they are part of the meal. Helotus bows and leaves. The door closes behind him. For a heartbeat, he hears a voice, one of the sisters, making a sound that is not quite a word. Then the palace swallows it. For 3 hours, Helotus sits in the servants' quarters, staring at stone, practicing the ancient skill of forgetting while awake. He tries to erase the evening from his mind, because in this place, memory is a crime without trial. But the more he tries to forget, the clearer the torchlight becomes in his thoughts, the sharper the tremble of Julia's hands, the emptier Drusilla's eyes. When he returns, the emperor is gone. The sisters remain. Their hair is undone. Their garments are disordered. Their faces are not the faces of women leaving a banquet. Drusilla cries without sound, tears sliding as if the body is leaking sorrow it can no longer hold. Agrippina does not cry. Her face has hardened into something carved, a mask built not from calm, but from survival. Julia Livilla lies unconscious, breathing shallowly, the mercy of darkness granting her a temporary escape. Helotus clears the plates. His hands are steady, because his life depends on steadiness. But inside, the human part of him fractures. And somewhere in Rome's future buried in manuscripts, in hostile histories, in accounts written by men who knew how to weaponize scandal, a question waits like a locked door. Was this only rumor, or the palace's most guarded ritual? Because if it was real, then the empire did not merely tolerate it. It applauded it. The ritual behind closed doors in Rome, incest was a crime against gods and blood alike. Yet inside the imperial palace, it was reshaped into ceremony. Servants whispered of a passage where doors opened only from one side. What historians dismissed as rumor, witnesses recorded as routine. The Palatine Palace was not a single structure, but a labyrinth layered across generations of emperors, its marble corridors built to impress the public and conceal the private. Beneath the grand halls where senators bowed and generals pledged loyalty existed another network narrow passages, hidden entrances, silent corridors where torches burned lower and footsteps carried farther than they should. It was here, beyond ceremony and law, that power took its most intimate forms. Among the servants assigned to the women's quarters was a Greek-born attendant named Cytheris, a woman who had served imperial households since childhood. She had dressed empresses, prepared brides for political marriages, and witnessed the quiet suffering that often accompanied power. Yet even her seasoned silence was tested when Caligula summoned his sisters not to public banquets, but through private corridors after midnight. Cytheris first noticed the passage connected to Drusilla's chambers. It was narrow, designed not for processions, but for secrecy, lit by lamps that never fully chased away shadow. There was no lock on Drusilla's side. The emperor's entrance required no permission, no announcement. The door opened when he wished it opened. At first, the palace staff explained it as familial devotion. Rome valued blood ties. An emperor honoring his sisters could be framed as virtue. Coins had already been minted, bearing their images beside his own, symbols of unity, security, and divine favor. Publicly, the narrative was clear. The siblings who had survived family tragedy together now ruled together in harmony. Privately, harmony had a different sound. Cytheris wrote years later, in hidden Greek script, that Drusilla stopped sleeping at night. She would lie awake listening, her breathing shallow, her body rigid as if anticipating impact. When footsteps came through the passage, her face would empty, as though her spirit withdrew before her body was summoned to endure whatever followed. No servant was meant to witness what occurred once the door closed. Yet servants existed in the margins of rooms, in shadowed corners, trained to be invisible but present. Cytheris observed the aftermaths rather than the acts, the trembling hands, the silence that followed visits, the way Drusilla sometimes whispered prayers not to be heard by gods, but simply to keep herself from breaking apart. Agrippina responded differently. Where Drusilla's suffering eroded her, Agrippina's sharpened her. Cytheris described her gaze as military, always analyzing, always calculating distances between power and opportunity. When summoned, Agrippina complied outwardly, but her mind, Cytheris sensed, was elsewhere measuring weakness, storing humiliation like a debt to be collected. Julia Livilla, the youngest, fled inward rather than outward. She drank constantly. Wine mixed with stronger sedatives dulled her awareness until she floated through days in a haze. When called to the emperor, she arrived already numbed, her consciousness muffled behind intoxication. Palace guests laughed at her excess, believing it decadence. Only the servants recognized it as survival. The emperor did not hide these dynamics entirely. That was the most disturbing element. At formal dinners, he positioned Drusilla beside him in the place reserved for wives, not sisters. He touched her casually while speaking philosophy, while discussing governance, while senators pretended not to notice. Agrippina and Julia were placed close enough to reinforce the spectacle family transformed into courtly theater. One senator, unable to disguise his discomfort, stared too long at the emperor's hand, resting on Drusilla's thigh during a banquet. Within days, he was arrested for treason. The charge had nothing to do with what he saw. The punishment had everything to do with the fact that he had seen it. Thus, the ritual expanded beyond private chambers into public complicity. Rome's elite became witnesses forced into silence. To acknowledge what occurred was death. To ignore it was survival. So they ignored. They applauded. They dined beneath torchlight, while taboo was rewritten as imperial privilege. Historians would later debate these accounts for centuries. Some claimed they were slander written after Caligula's death. Yet the consistency across hostile and neutral sources, across servant testimonies and administrative records, suggested something darker than propaganda. Too many witnesses described the same patterns. Too many details aligned. And then came the act that shattered any remaining illusion that this was merely private depravity. When Drusilla died, Caligula did not mourn like a brother. He mourned like a husband, and worshipped her like a goddess. The sister who became a goddess when Drusilla died. Rome expected mourning. Instead, the empire witnessed a transformation that defied religion, law, and nature. Caligula did not bury his sister. He crowned her divine. Drusilla's death began quietly. Official records claimed fever, a brief illness. Physicians summoned too late. It was the kind of explanation Rome had heard many times before, the polite language used when imperial truths were too dangerous to describe directly. But inside the palace, servants recorded something different, not the cause of death, but the emperor's reaction to it. Caligula did not grieve like a brother. He collapsed like a man whose world had been amputated. For days he refused food, refused sleep, refused governance. He wandered the palace at night, calling Drusilla's name into corridors that gave no answer. Torches burned low as he paced marble halls barefoot, his hair uncut, his garments unwashed, as if mourning had consumed not just his heart, but his identity. Rome had seen emperors mourn before, but this was excessive, theatrical, obsessive. And then the mourning turned into something else entirely. He declared that laughter during the mourning period was treason. Informers spread across the empire listening for smiles, for careless jokes, for citizens who dared feel anything but grief. Several were executed, simply for appearing cheerful in public. The sorrow of one man had become law for millions. But Caligula was not satisfied with grief. Grief was mortal. He wanted permanence. Within weeks, he announced what no emperor had ever attempted before. Drusilla would become divine. The Senate was summoned. Priests were assembled. Religious scholars were forced into consultation not to debate, but to legitimize. Caligula spoke not as a ruler requesting approval, but as a god issuing revelation. Drusilla, he proclaimed, had ascended. She was now Diva Drusilla, a goddess of Rome. Temples would be built in her honor, statues commissioned, priests appointed, festivals established. Citizens across the empire would offer incense in her name. Soldiers would swear loyalty, invoking her spirit. Magistrates would include her in sacred oaths. It was the first time in Roman history that a woman mortal, imperial, controversial, was elevated to official divine status. The religious symbolism was deliberate. Caligula associated her with Venus, goddess of love. To the public, it was framed as familial devotion, a brother honoring a beloved sister. But beneath the ceremony lay a darker reinterpretation. The empire was being forced to sanctify a relationship already whispered about in horror. Worship blurred the boundary between reverence and justification. One senator, Livius Geminius, publicly claimed he had witnessed Drusilla's spirit ascending to the heavens. He described divine light, celestial voices, acceptance among the gods. Caligula rewarded him with immense wealth. Soon, more witnesses came forward. Visions multiplied. Revelations spread. Theaters staged divine ascension reenactments. Coins bore her likeness crowned in celestial iconography. Shrines appeared across provinces where citizens prayed to a woman whose life had ended at 21 under circumstances no one dared articulate openly. Refusal was not tolerated. An equestrian who questioned why a mortal deserved worship was executed within the day. Priests who hesitated were replaced. Provincial governors were instructed to enforce the new cult with absolute compliance. Thus, violation was transformed into theology. Rome-proud, disciplined, tradition-bound Rome found itself kneeling before a goddess born not of myth, but of imperial obsession. Within the palace, reactions differed. Servants whispered that Drusilla's chambers were left untouched, preserved like a shrine. Caligula visited them frequently, speaking to empty air, insisting she answered. Some nights, he ordered banquets prepared in her honor, reclining beside her empty couch as if she still lived. Agrippina watched all of this in silence. Where others saw madness, she saw instruction. Power, she realized, could rewrite reality itself. Crime could become ritual. Ritual could become religion. Religion could command an empire's obedience. Her brother had not merely broken taboos. He had forced the world to worship their aftermath. Julia Livilla, already fragile, withdrew further into intoxication, unable to process the grotesque elevation of their shared suffering. The palace became heavier with silence, as though even the walls understood that Rome had crossed into something irreversible. Historians would later debate whether Caligula truly believed in Drusilla's divinity, or whether the deification was the ultimate act of possession claiming her not only in life, but in eternity. But inside the imperial household, one truth settled like ash. If an emperor could turn violation into worship, then nothing, no law, no god, no tradition stood beyond his reach. The revenge born in silence, one sister shattered under the weight of the palace, but another began to sharpen. Where grief consumed Rome, calculation awakened behind imperial eyes. A victim the emperor believed broken was quietly learning how to destroy him. After Drusilla's deification, the palace changed in ways even seasoned servants struggled to describe. Grief did not fade, it congealed. Ritual replaced mourning. Incense burned daily in private chambers. Priests walked corridors that had once belonged only to slaves and soldiers. It was as though the emperor had fused religion with obsession, forcing Rome to orbit the memory of a woman whose suffering had never been publicly named. Amid this transformation, Agrippina endured. She did not collapse like Drusilla had. She did not dissolve into intoxication like Julia Livilla. Instead, she adapted. Servants began noticing subtle shifts, not in her obedience, which remained flawless, but in her attention. She listened more than she spoke. She memorized faces. She studied which senators bowed deepest, which guards lingered longest, which advisers Caligula trusted when paranoia surged. Trauma had not destroyed her. It had educated her. Cytheris, the attendant who had watched the sisters for years, later wrote that Agrippina's silence felt heavier than the emperor's rage. Drusilla's suffering had been visible tears, trembling, physical erosion. Agrippina's was internalized, forged into something cold and deliberate. She no longer reacted emotionally when summoned. Her compliance was mechanical, her gaze distant, not broken, but calculating. She was learning the architecture of power. Caligula, meanwhile, descended deeper into instability. Drusilla's death had fractured whatever restraint remained. He issued decrees impulsively, elevated himself in divine imagery, demanded worship not only for his sister, but increasingly for himself. Senators who once feared him now feared unpredictability itself. Execution lists expanded. Accusations of treason became casual tools. Fear spread through Rome's elite like rot beneath marble. Agrippina saw opportunity inside that fear. She began rebuilding alliances quietly. Through servants, through dismissed officials, through exiled sympathizers, messages moved in coded language. She rekindled contact with senators who resented Caligula's humiliations. She communicated with military figures whose loyalty to the emperor was weakening under erratic command. One such figure was Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Gaetulicus, a respected commander stationed in Upper Germany. Gaetulicus had survived multiple reigns, a man skilled in balancing loyalty with survival. His correspondence with Agrippina began cautiously expressions of concern, veiled sympathies, philosophical discussions about Rome's future. Beneath the words lay conspiracy. Agrippina understood that removing an emperor required more than resentment. It required military backing, senatorial support, and a replacement candidate acceptable to Rome's fragile political balance. That candidate emerged in Marcus Aemilius Lepidus Drusilla's widower, still connected to the imperial family, politically malleable, lacking Caligula's volatility. Meetings were arranged in secrecy. They occurred in villas beyond Rome's central scrutiny, in bathhouses where steam muffled speech, in gardens where distance obscured lip movement. Agrippina attended veiled, escorted, silent yet commanding. Witnesses later described her presence not as grieving sister, but as strategist. The plan was simple in concept, impossible in risk. Eliminate Caligula, install Lepidus, restore political stability, free the surviving sisters from imperial captivity disguised as privilege. But power built on fear breeds informers. Caligula's surveillance network was extensive spies among servants, soldiers, even senators desperate to prove loyalty. Whispers of conspiracy reached the emperor while he traveled through Gaul. His response was immediate, surgical, merciless. Gaetulicus was arrested and executed without trial. Lepidus was seized, tortured, and forced to confess not only political betrayal, but alleged intimate relationships with Caligula's sisters. Whether true or fabricated mattered little. Caligula weaponized the testimony publicly, accusing Agrippina and Julia Livilla of both treason and moral corruption. The irony was grotesque. The emperor who had violated them now condemned them for violation. Their honors were stripped, wealth confiscated, titles erased. Before exile, Caligula staged a final humiliation. The sisters were forced to carry Lepidus's ashes through Rome's streets, displaying their betrayal before citizens who had once worshipped them as near divine figures. Agrippina walked with expressionless composure. Julia Livilla barely remained conscious, weakened by years of intoxication and shock. Crowds watched in silence, not sympathetic, not hostile, simply afraid. Exile followed swiftly. Not to comfortable estates, but to the Pontian Islands' barren rocks, where imperial prisoners were sent to disappear slowly. The same islands where their mother had died years earlier under similar condemnation. As ships carried them away from Rome's skyline, Agrippina did not weep. She watched the receding empire with the same calculating gaze Cytheris had described years before. She had failed once, but she had learned more than failure had cost her. On that desolate horizon, stripped of power yet forged by humiliation, she made a decision that would reshape Rome's future. She would never be powerless again. Exile, starvation, and the Death Islands Rome did not execute imperial traitors. It erased them slowly. On barren islands where even birds refused to land, emperors buried their enemies alive in time. One sister began dying the moment she arrived. The other began planning the moment she survived. The Pontian Islands rose from the Mediterranean like broken teeth, jagged, wind-beaten, stripped of mercy. They were not prisons built of walls. They were prisons built of isolation. Rome sent its unwanted blood here to fade quietly, far from spectacle, far from sympathy, far from history's gaze. Agrippina and Julia Livilla arrived under armed escort, their imperial titles meaningless against the indifferent stone. The guards did not salute them. The attendants did not kneel. Here, lineage offered no protection. Survival depended on provisions rationed by soldiers who had been instructed to keep prisoners alive, but never comfortable. Shelter was crude weathered huts once used by previous exiles. Food arrived irregularly: coarse grain, dried fish, brackish water that tasted faintly of rust and salt. There were no physicians, no priests, no ceremonies. Only wind, sun, and the slow erosion of the human body. Julia Livilla began deteriorating almost immediately. Deprived of wine, deprived of the sedatives that had dulled her awareness inside the palace, she faced reality unfiltered for the first time in years. Servants noted her trembling, her restless pacing along the cliffs, her sleepless nights broken by sobs she no longer attempted to conceal. She had been the youngest, the least prepared, the one who had sought escape through oblivion rather than resistance. On the islands, there was no escape left. Agrippina observed her sister's decline with a grief she refused to display. Emotion, she had learned, was a vulnerability predators exploited. She rationed food meticulously, preserved strength, forced her body to adapt to deprivation. Each sunrise was endured not as suffering, but as endurance training for a future she refused to abandon. She studied the guards, their routines, their complacency, their boredom. Even in exile, her mind remained imperial, mapping power dynamics, calculating leverage, imagining contingencies. But Julia Livilla did not possess that resilience. Weeks turned to months. Her body weakened without constant intoxication to mask trauma. She spoke less, ate less. Eventually, she stopped eating altogether. Official reports would later record starvation as the cause of death. But the guards noted something more deliberate: refusal. Julia Livilla lay on the rocks overlooking the sea, watching waves crash endlessly against stone, as if waiting for the water to erase her existence. She was 22 when she died. No funeral rites were performed. No imperial honors granted. Her body was buried in unmarked ground among other forgotten exiles, princes, senators, generals whose names had once commanded Rome. Agrippina stood at the burial without tears. But witnesses recorded the stillness in her posture, the way her hands clenched until the knuckles whitened. Another sister gone. Another life consumed by imperial power disguised as justice. The islands had claimed their mother years before. Now they had claimed Julia. Agrippina alone remained. Seasons passed. Summers burned skin raw beneath merciless sun. Winters brought cutting winds that sliced through thin garments. Many exiles died within a year. Agrippina survived too. She adapted, ruthlessly rationing food, strengthening her body through forced endurance, preserving her health as if preparing for war. Because in her mind, exile was not the end of her story. It was preparation. She thought constantly about Caligula, his paranoia, his unpredictability, the growing resentment within Rome's military and senate. Madness bred enemies. Enemies bred conspiracies. Conspiracies bred opportunities. She thought about her son Nero, still a child in Rome. If Caligula lived, the boy would eventually be executed as a potential rival. Survival for Nero required the emperor's downfall. Survival for Agrippina required patience. Thus, on a wind-swept island where Rome expected her to wither, she hardened instead. Trauma, humiliation, exile, each layer forged something colder within her, something shaped not by grief, but by ambition, sharpened through suffering. When news finally reached the islands in early 41 AD, it arrived not as ceremony, but as rumor carried by guards unable to hide their agitation. Caligula was dead, assassinated within his own palace corridors, stabbed repeatedly by men who had once sworn loyalty. His blood spilled beneath the same marble ceilings where he had redefined power as violation. Agrippina did not celebrate openly. She listened, confirmed, calculated, because the death of one emperor did not guarantee freedom. It merely began a new struggle for power. Trauma that corrupted an empire. Caligula's death ended a tyrant, but not the darkness he unleashed. One surviving sister returned from exile, carrying scars Rome could not see. The victim of the palace would soon hold power powerful enough to reshape an empire. When the ships arrived to retrieve Agrippina from the Pontian Islands, Rome had already begun rewriting its loyalties. Caligula's assassination had plunged the empire into a brief but violent uncertainty. Guards switching allegiances, senators scrambling to survive, bloodlines recalculated overnight. The new emperor was Claudius Caligula's uncle, a man long dismissed as weak, scholarly, physically frail. He had survived previous reigns by appearing harmless, by hiding intellect behind awkward speech and fragile posture. Now, by the will of the Praetorian Guard, he wore the imperial purple. One of his earliest decrees was the recall of political exiles. Agrippina returned to Rome not as a triumphant princess, but as a survivor stepping back into the architecture of her trauma. She was 26, hardened by deprivation, sharpened by loss. She had outlived the brother who had violated her, outlived the island meant to erase her, outlived the sister who had chosen death over endurance. But survival had transformed her. Servants who had known her before exile whispered that her eyes had changed. Where once there had been aristocratic pride, there was now calculation layered with cold restraint. She did not seek comfort. She sought position. Power, she had learned, was the only shield that could never be stripped away. Over the next years, Agrippina maneuvered through Rome's political landscape with precision learned in captivity. She married strategically, eliminating vulnerabilities, consolidating influence. When her second husband died under suspicious circumstances, rumors surfaced, but no accusation stuck. She was too careful, too patient, too essential to imperial legitimacy. Her ultimate move reshaped the dynasty. She married Emperor Claudius, himself her own uncle. The union shocked Rome, but imperial bloodlines often bent morality for continuity. Through marriage, Agrippina entered the throne room, not as victim but as empress. From that position, she began the long game she had envisioned during exile. Her son, Nero, became the centerpiece. She persuaded Claudius to adopt him as heir, displacing the emperor's biological son, Britannicus. Advisors loyal to her filled key positions. Rivals were exiled, discredited, or quietly removed. Coins were minted depicting Agrippina beside Claudius, an unprecedented elevation for a living Roman woman. She had achieved what exile was meant to prevent: power. But power does not erase trauma. It mutates it. Ancient sources describe Agrippina's rule behind the throne as ruthless, protective, obsessive. She controlled access to the emperor, monitored political movements, and ensured Nero's supremacy at all costs. When Claudius began reconsidering succession, showing renewed favor toward Britannicus, he died suddenly. Most historians agree on the cause: poisoned mushrooms, administered by agents loyal to Agrippina. Nero ascended the throne at 16. For a time, Agrippina ruled through him, guiding decisions, shaping policy, ensuring loyalty networks remained intact. She had secured the one outcome her younger self could never have imagined during the palace horrors. She stood above the system that had once consumed her. But power raised in trauma breeds instability. Nero grew resentful under his mother's control. Advisors whispered against her influence. The son she had protected began to see her not as savior, but as rival. Tensions escalated into surveillance, then into open hostility. Agrippina had created an emperor. She had also created her executioner. Nero first attempted subtle removal, stripping her honors, reducing her guards, isolating her politically. When she survived these degradations, he escalated. A pleasure barge was constructed with a hidden mechanism designed to collapse at sea. Agrippina was invited aboard under the pretense of reconciliation. The boat shattered mid-voyage, but she survived, swimming to shore under moonlight. When news reached Nero, fear overrode hesitation. Soldiers were dispatched to her villa. According to Tacitus, when they entered her chamber, Agrippina did not beg. She exposed her abdomen and commanded them to strike there, the wound that had borne the emperor who now sought her death. She died at 43. Thus ended the last surviving sister of Caligula's household terror. Drusilla had died young, sanctified by obsession. Julia Livilla had starved in exile, erased by despair. Agrippina had conquered power, only to be destroyed by the legacy she forged. The cycle was complete. Caligula's violence had not ended with his assassination. It had propagated, shaping survivors, shaping rulers, shaping Rome itself. Trauma had climbed the throne, worn the crown, issued decrees, and demanded blood. Today, the Palatine Palace stands in ruins. Tourists walk its foundations unaware of the private ceremonies once hidden behind marble walls. Plaques describe architecture. Guides recount political reforms. But the sisters' suffering remains buried in restricted archives, fragmented manuscripts, and histories softened by euphemism. Yet the pattern endures. Power without restraint. Family bonds weaponized. Public ritual masking private horror. The empire fell. The palace crumbled. But the lessons remain carved deeper than stone. What Caligula forced upon his sisters did not end with their deaths. It echoed through emperors, dynasties, and generations, proving that when absolute power enters the home, even blood becomes a battlefield.